morning, church.
Good morning.
It's always a great day when we can be together to worship God, to sing songs to Him, and to meet around the table and to celebrate Jesus and what He means to us. I find that these times together, for me personally, are very uplifting and encouraging. This morning's lesson is about how we are called to serve others through the gift of the gospel. There's a couple of ways that I could have taken this sermon, but I wanted to this morning focus on the humility of Jesus and the dangers of self-pride. I've read several articles on this morning's subject. I'm going to be sharing a few thoughts from a daily devotional that I was going through. And I just hope that the things that I've prepared this morning will cause you to think and maybe increase your desire to serve Jesus and our Heavenly Father. The ultimate instruction, though, comes from the Bible. And I do have many, many scriptures that I'm going to be sharing with you as well on the subject. Yesterday at the Central Church of Christ in Winnipeg, Jay and Miles led us in a preaching workshop. And yesterday's class was quite enlightening, and had the privilege of having Michael and Mark there with us in the class. So I'm going to ask those two gentlemen to kind of grade my sermon this morning, see how close I come to the points that were discussed yesterday. Personally, I think I'm failing miserably, but we'll see how it goes. Before I get started, I want to share a story with you that was sent to me by someone. I can't remember. It was a while ago. And I think in a couple of ways it does speak to us about a couple of the points in the sermon this morning. A widow was struggling financially, and she was very, very low on food. So low on food, in fact, that she didn't even have the bare necessities to make a single pancake. One morning she, out of desperation, got down on her knees beside the open window in her home there, and she just lifted her eyes to heaven, and she raised her hands, and she began praying. She told God what she was going through and how it was affecting her. And she just prayed that if it was His will, would He please, please, please send her some food. And she was praying fervently. Now, her next door neighbor was an atheist, and he just happened to be out in the yard near the open window, and he heard her praying. And he says, I'm going to teach this old gal a lesson. So he goes off to the store, he buys $1,000 worth of groceries, he bags them up, he takes them to her house, he places them on the front step, rings the doorbell, and then hides in the bushes by the door. She opens the door and she sees the bags of groceries. And she just lifts her eyes and her hands to heaven and she says, God did it. God did it. God did it. And then her neighbor jumped out of the bushes. And he said, your God didn't do it. I did it. I heard you praying to a God that doesn't exist. So I went down to the store and I bought these groceries and I placed them here. I wanted to see her reaction. And she just continued, God did it. God did it. God did it. He says, no, you're not hearing me. Your God doesn't exist. I heard you praying to Him. I went down to the store. I bought all these groceries. I bagged them. I put them in my car. I drove them here. I placed them on the step. I rang the doorbell. I hid in the bush. I wanted to see your reaction. She continued, God did it. God did it. God did it. And He made the devil pay for them. The lesson is always pray. Always believe in the power of prayer. and have faith in the power of God, and know that God will use people in different ways to answer our prayers. A sermon is a bit like a meal. We know that the scriptures are spiritual food, and I hope that my sermon this morning has some good side dishes along with the main course. And before any meal, we set the table. And so let's take first a bit of a look at the background of the book of Philippians. Of the 4 prison epistles, Paul wrote Philippians last near the end of his Roman imprisonment, probably around 61 or 62 AD. Paul sent the other 3 prison epistles, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, by the hand of Tychicus, as their destinations were near one another. However, the letter to the Philippians was to be delivered by Epaphroditus, who had come to Paul in Rome with financial help from the church at Philippi, Philippians 2, verse 25. But during his time in Rome, Epaphroditus took ill, which delayed his return home and the delivery of the letter. The Apostle Paul did not write Philippians in response to a crisis as he did with Galatians and Colossians. Instead, he wrote to express his appreciation and affection of the Philippian believers. More than any other church, the believers in Philippi offered Paul material support for his ministry. We read this in Philippians 4, verses 14 through 16. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need. Paul's love for these people is clear throughout the letter as he encourages them to live out their faith and joy. Philippians 1, verses 3 through 5. Philippians brims over with passages that we have all heard many times before. He who began a good work in you will carry it on for completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Philippians 1, verse 6. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Philippians 1, verse 21. And I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Philippians 4, verse 13. And that's just to name a few. The portrait of Jesus Christ as a humble servant is at the core of Paul's teaching in this letter. We just read Philippians 2, verses 3 through 8. And if you read a few verses beyond that, it reads, Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Paul's joy at just the thought of the Philippian church is undeniable in the letter, and it's that same joy that he wanted the recipients, the Philippians, to possess as well. To lead the Philippians to this truth, Paul took them directly to Jesus, teaching them that a community of believers living in harmony with one another comes only through mutual humility modeled after the Savior. Paul wrote that he poured out his life as an offering for the sake of Christ, leading Paul to find great joy and contentment in his service. His letter to the Philippians showed them that by centering their lives on Christ, that they too might live in true joy. So for the next few moments, I'd like to try and focus on 3 key points from our reading this morning. I'd like to focus on the danger of pride, the power of a perspective shift, and the power of a Christ-like humility. In verse 3 of our text, Paul writes, Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Selfish ambition refers to a strong desire to achieve personal goals or success at the expense of others, prioritizing one's own advancement and interests above the needs and the well-being of those around them. Often driven by ego and a me-first mentality, it's essentially ambition that is solely focused on personal gain, neglecting the good of the group or the community. Some key points about selfish ambition. There's a focus on self. The primary concern is personal gain, status, or recognition, and not the collective benefit. There's a lack of consideration for others. It may involve stepping on others, undermining colleagues, or neglecting their needs to achieve one's own goals. It's a selfish ambition that is motivated by envy or competition, and it can be fueled by a desire to outshine or to be better than others. Selfish ambition can also be destructive. It can lead to strained relationships, to workplace conflict, and it has a negative impact on team dynamics. Some examples of selfish ambition. A co-worker who constantly is taking credit for team projects to appear more successful than the others. Or someone who is aggressively campaigning for a promotion, disregarding the impact on their colleagues, their co-workers. Or it could be an individual who's constantly seeking attention and praise, even when it means putting others down. So you see that selfish ambition is destructive and very much counterproductive. Now, vain conceit means an excessive pride in oneself, often manifested as an inflated sense of self-importance, where someone believes that they are superior to others, and they focus too much on their own achievements, bragging. They focus on their appearance, their abilities, often to the point of what we view as arrogance. Essentially, it's a boastful and self-centered attitude. So some things about vain conceit. Where does the phrase come from? Well, vain, it means excessively proud of oneself or futile. Conceit meaning an exaggerated opinion of one's own importance. It has an excessive self-regard. A person with vain conceit overestimates their own worth and abilities. It has a preoccupation with appearance. This can include obsessive focus on physical attractiveness and outward presentation. It has a need for validation. Individuals with vain conceit often crave admiration and emotion from others. It has a negative impact on relationships. This attitude can strain relationships due to a lack of humility or consideration for others. Selfish ambition and vain conceit combine to make up pride. The scriptures have much to say about pride, and none of it's positive. Pride is sin, and therefore nothing positive can be said about it. We read in Proverbs 8:13, "To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior, and perverse speech." Now, I realize that the term pride is not always viewed in a negative way. It's most often used as a term of acclamation, usually representing our feelings toward the accomplishment of someone that we have some affiliation with. It might be a child or a grandchild or a good friend. Merriam-Webster Dictionary describes the use of this term in this way as satisfaction with your or another's achievements. Also goes on to define the word pride used in relation to oneself as simply a feeling of self-respect and personal worth. So we need to be careful in making the biblical term and its meaning out of touch. It might be that approach has caused so many to lose sight of the problems and dangers that are associated with pride. We know the mantra of the world today is me, me, me. Or as the ad slogan says, because I'm worth it. We see the results in different ways in the world today because of self-centeredness. We only have to look so far as the political leaders of countries around the world. Their self-centeredness can bring about conflict and pain, emotional distress, and alienate people against each other, alienating family and friends, even business colleagues. So what are some of the problems and dangers that are associated with pride? Pride is often the motivator for other sin. The first sin to be committed in the world was due to pride. Genesis 3, verses 1 through 12. Adam and Eve fell to the wiles of the serpent and believed that they could be more, so they ate of the fruit that was forbidden them by God. It was also the motivator for the first murder ever committed upon the earth. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 12, "Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the devil, to the evil one, and murdered his brother." And why did he murder him? Because of his own actions were evil, but his brothers were righteous. Take note of what Ezekiel says about Sodom and her pride. in Ezekiel 16, verse 49. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. He really pulled no punches there, didn't he? Pride makes us oblivious to danger. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16, verse 18. The idea here is that pride leads to destruction and causes one to fall. Solomon says a haughty spirit comes before a fall. One will fall because he walks with his nose in the air, thus not watching where he is going. And we must be able to recognize and see the stumbling blocks that Satan puts in our way, or we will trip and fall over them. We simply don't see the danger because we don't believe that we can be affected by it. Pride makes us blind. We become blind to our own condition before God. The Pharisees are a prime example of those who were infected with pride and spiritual blindness. In the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, Jesus addresses pride and spiritual blindness. Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. In the parable, the Pharisee could not see his spiritual condition because of pride resulting in his self-righteousness. This parable also shows the danger of comparing ourselves to others. We should strive to be acceptable to God and not just better than others. Christians must understand that we are saved by God's grace. Ephesians 2, 8 and 10. The only thing that separates us from the world is the blood of Christ, not our righteousness or our self-worth. The Pharisee of Luke 18 was not praying to God, but he was praying to himself. God resists the proud, gives grace to the humble. James 4, verse 6. It was this type of humility that was clearly displayed by the tax collector who was so despised by the Pharisee. In another instance, Jesus healed a blind man who has been born that way. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. The man was later cast out of the synagogue because he praised Jesus for healing him. After hearing that the man had been cast out of the synagogue, Jesus came to him and gave him affirmation of his belief in him. Jesus then stated that he had come into the world to give sight to the spiritually humble and blindness to the spiritually arrogant. The Pharisees responded by asking Jesus if they were blind also. And Jesus responded by telling them, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." John chapter 9, verse 41. Pride makes us forget who we are and who we're not. We need to be aware of some of the fallout from pride. Here's a small sampling of that fallout. Pride makes us foolish. Pride can contribute to one's independence by fostering a sense of self-worth and confidence, allowing one to believe in their abilities to make decisions and to achieve goals on their own. Excessive pride can become arrogance, hindering genuine independence by isolating individuals and preventing them from seeking necessary support, and ultimately making them look foolish. We read in Scripture, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Proverbs 1, verse 7. Pride causes us to think foolishly. Pride gives men a foolish sense of wisdom. Even when something is obvious and goes against conventional knowledge, we tend to lean on our own understanding, thinking that it's more than enough. We might say, "I'm good. I know this." We read in Romans 12, verse 3, "For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith that God has distributed to each of you." And in Proverbs 12, verse 15, "The way of fools seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice." Pride causes us to act foolishly. In 1 Kings 12, verses 3 through 16, we see this in this passage how Rehoboam rejected the advice given him by the elders concerning the children of Israel's request to have their yoke lightened. And he instead went with the advice of the younger men who had grown up with him, and he acted foolishly by increasing the workload of the Israelites. Pride makes us independent. Pride can contribute to independence by fostering a sense of self-worth and overconfidence, allowing individuals to believe in their abilities to make decisions and to achieve goals on their own. Excessive pride can become arrogance, hindering genuine independence by isolating from necessary support. Pride prevents us from learning anything. Pride gives us a self-assurance that quite often backfires on us. In Proverbs 11, verse 2, we read, "When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom." We see in John chapter 9, verses 35 through 41, how the Pharisees, when confronted with the truth, how their actions, when they kicked the former blind man out of the temple, pointed to and highlighted their own self-righteousness and their unwillingness to learn and accept the truth, even when it was undeniable evidence right in front of them. Pride condemns us to hell. In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 12, as we read earlier, the Lord Almighty has a day in store for all the proud and lofty, for all that is exalted, and they will be humbled. Human pride and arrogance have always been significant themes in the Scriptures, drawing God's attention and ultimately His judgment. In this verse, Isaiah emphasizes the inevitability of God's day of reckoning, affirming that all who are proud and self-exalted will find themselves humbled before Him. In all of these scriptures from the Bible, there is nothing good said about pride, because in reality there is nothing good about it. We must work hard to keep it from invading our lives, our character, and refrain from displaying it at all costs. We've probably all had at one time or another a person or people in our lives, whether through work or in our communities, or maybe it's a neighbor who exhibited traits of pride. They're not fun to be around, to work with, or to have to deal with. It's frustrating. It can really drag you down and slow down progress in whatever the situation is. It's important that we understand what selfish ambition and vain conceit are if we're to be like Christ. I know that everyone knows and understands who Jesus was and how He handled Himself in any situation that we might encounter here on earth. He showed us how to handle it, and He handled everything with humility. What does Christ-like humility look like? I'm pretty sure that if I asked everyone in this room to give me one or two character traits of what Jesus' humility looked like, I'm sure that some of you would share the same ones. A Christ-like humility refers to the act of demonstrating humility in a way that mirrors the example that was set by Christ, which essentially means prioritizing the needs of others, serving them selflessly, and putting aside personal pride, even to the point of sacrifice, as Jesus did by giving His life on the cross. So some key points about Christ-like humility. It is complete selflessness, putting the needs of others before your own, just as Jesus did. It is displayed in service to others, actively seeking to serve others and to contribute to their well-being. And when I say others, I'm not meaning necessarily a group, but just one individual that might come into our life, that we might know. It might be a neighbor, it might be a friend, it might be a stranger. That's what I mean by others. It is complete humility before God, recognizing one's dependence on God and not seeking personal glory. It is about forgiveness, being willing to forgive others as Jesus forgave all of His persecutors. And it's about heartfelt compassion, showing empathy and concern for those who are suffering. A biblical example is found in Philippians 2, verses 6 through 8. This passage describes how Jesus emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. To apply Christ-like humility, we must develop an attitude of focusing on and prioritizing needs of others above our own, actively serving others and admitting our mistakes, being open to learning and recognizing that all good things come from God, essentially mirroring Jesus' actions of a selfless attitude, and by service, by putting others first, even when it means sacrificing our own desires or having to take on a lower position. some key aspects for applying Christ-like humility. We do so in selfless service, by actively seeking opportunities to serve others without expecting any recognition or reward, just like Jesus washed his disciples' feet. We display humility in our leadership in our homes, leadership in our community, and leadership in the church. If we are in a leadership position, we must lead with a servant's heart, valuing the contributions of others and not seeking personal glory. We do so by acknowledging a dependence on God. Recognize that our abilities and achievements come from God and not solely from our own abilities or our own doing. We do so by being teachable, maintaining an open mind and being willing to learn from others even when they might be considered lower than we are. And we do so by forgiving, having forgiveness and empathy. We forgive others readily and strive to understand their perspectives just as Jesus forgave those who crucified him. And we do so by putting others first, prioritizing needs and well-being of others over our own personal desires. It might be that I have to step out of my comfort zone, that I might have to reach out and try to do something that I've never done before. A few biblical examples of Christ-like humility. From our reading this morning, Jesus emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and becoming obedient even to death. Another example in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17, where Jesus is washing his disciples' feet, demonstrating a servant leadership. And in verses 14 through 17 of this passage, he sums it up for his disciples by telling them, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set an example that you should do so, as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." And another example found in Matthew chapter 11, verse 29. "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." Why? "For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." So how should we practice this Christ-like humility? And I realize that some of this may sound repetitive. By reflecting on our actions is one way. Regularly examining our motivations and behaviors to identify areas where we can be more humble. By praying for humility, asking God to help us to develop a humble heart and a humble perspective. By seeking feedback, be open to a constructive criticism from others and use it to grow yourself. By practicing gratitude, regularly acknowledging the blessings in our life and thanking God for them. By volunteering our time, actively seeking opportunities to serve others in our community, or in our neighborhoods, or in our church, or in our workplace. Now I realize that this morning I've covered an awful lot of material. Most of it is probably a sermon unto itself. And I hope I haven't made it seem like, man, this is just an impossible task to serve like Jesus. If we can just understand one thing, that humility in everything that we do leads to a precedence being set in our lives. And if we do that, if we have this humility and develop this humility and practice humility on a daily basis, then I believe that serving and doing the things that are right and necessary and good in God's eyes will come naturally. So I encourage each of you to find small ways that you can serve both at church and in your community. I know you will be blessed because of it. You will grow because of it. But more importantly, you will be a blessing to others as you strive to do the Lord's will here on earth. So if you're here this morning and been thinking about giving your life to Christ, won't you consider that? Or maybe there's something that you need to talk about. maybe some struggle that you're having and you just need to talk. I know the elders or some of the deacons are able to do that. So if that's what you're looking for, maybe you need a prayer of encouragement, then let's make that happen. Thank you all for being here this morning, and thank you for your faith